Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
Again, we are really glad to have today's speaker. As we said, we are all mindful of the situation and the gravity of the situation with Ukraine. But we have taken a decision to continue with the circle for multiple reasons, not only that we just spoke with our esteemed guest today that Balkans actually can provide a lot of information and examples for lessons from the past that could be applicable, but also it is good to keep the community together on Fridays as we do. And continue our conversation with the wonderful work of the guests. And today, Mary, we do have our sixth appearance in the circle for the season, and we'll be looking forward to have a wonderful presentation, but also have people all the way to, was it Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan? I didn't hear.
Kyrgyzstan.
Kyrgyzstan. Okay, Nuri. So, which is, again, yet another widening of the circle. Without further ado, Mary, then I'll give you the honors to open today's circle and present our esteemed guest and to have wonderful session.
Well, welcome everyone to Balkan Circle. My name is Mary Neuberger, and I am the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and also a professor of history at UT Austin. I wanted to post our statement in which we stand with Ukraine, stand in support of the people of Ukraine. Our hearts and minds are with Ukraine. But today we're going to talk about the Balkans. So we're really excited to have with us Elidor Mëhilli, who teaches history and public policy at Hunter College, at the City University of New York, and at Columbia University. He's been writing on dictatorships, authoritarian regimes, and the diplomatic, economic, political, and cultural dimensions of the global Cold War. His first book, From Stalin to Mao, Albania and the Socialist World, was published by Cornell and won 3 book prizes. This is an amazing book. I've assigned it to my graduate students, so thank you so much for writing that book, and I hope everyone will read that book if they haven't already. Elidor received his PhD from Princeton University and lives in Brooklyn. So today, his talk is on Russian, French, English, the stories language books tell. So I'm really intrigued by this title and what you're going to talk to us about today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. Thank you to the Balkan Circle, to all of you who have taken your time today on Friday to come and hear me, to the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, for all the work that they've been doing for a number of years now to make Balkan studies so dynamic, but also for the work that you guys have been doing in this past couple of weeks, a community that has been very active as we have witnessed this war that has been launched by Russia against Ukraine. So let me begin by saying that it's impossible to work right now and to be in the mental space where Ukraine doesn't loom large, and it ought to be at the center of a lot of what we talk about. This talk was planned months ago, and I had very different things in my mind as I was planning it. It has changed a little bit. My approach to what I'm going to talk a little bit about today has changed, and I think one of the things that we've seen very clearly, very vividly, is just how much of an example Ukrainians are giving to the world in how to respond essentially to brutality. The geography and the historical examples that I will talk today might be thought of as distinct or remote or different in some ways, but let me point out one way in which I think there might be a connection here. Dictatorships and tyrants have used language as a weapon. We know this. We have been reminded of this again over the last couple of weeks as words and concepts have been sort of cynically bent out of shape, as talk of who is part of what civilization and who is not has become critically and important, and also has proliferated. We also know that to understand dictatorships, we need to take the state apparatus very seriously. We need to take seriously its fixations, its obsessions, its distortions of the past, and also of chronologies. At the same time, I think we also want to insist that language is a sphere where people try to find creative ways, where they want to pursue richness that goes against sometimes the interests of those who produce official culture. Sometimes people try to resist in the sphere of language, even as most people, as we also know, conform and adapt to the new reality in front of them. Sometimes they use tools provided by repressive states, but for their own individual purposes. And so it doesn't always work. The stakes are very high under police regimes, as we all know and don't need to be reminded. But dictatorship and censorship, as much as they can harden borders, both physical and metaphorical, still language is a sphere of world building, of imagination and self-fashioning. And so that's kind of the story that I'd like to take us a little bit on today, in telling a story about creativity and how people encountered languages. My intention essentially is sort of twofold. On the one hand, to make room a little bit in the kinds of stories that we tell about people who don't necessarily make it into textbooks. These are not people who necessarily write memoirs about their lives. These are not people whose names would be recognizable. And I will talk a little bit about this in a second. And they would never dare dream in the name of nations, to speak in the name of nations. But the second objective is to make room for objects that have been discarded, forgotten, kind of thrown out because they are not deemed as worthy, and sort of what they might tell about certain histories that are inconvenient for imperially minded narratives of the past. So I will be suggestive. I will not try to insist on a single argument, and I will try to cover a bit too much. So with that in mind, please do come to me with all kinds of questions and clarifications, and I would be more than happy to sort of go over things in a little bit more detail and hopefully leave a little bit of room for our discussion. Okay. So how am I going to try and do this? I think my intention will be to do it through a number of objects. I'm going to take you in a little bit of a tour using essentially actual books, actual artifacts. These are books about Russian and French and English. But I will talk a little bit about their reception. The specific context here is communist Albania, a country that had a very tumultuous history between the 1950s and the 1990s. It had a number of alliances, at first with Yugoslavia in the 40s, then with the Soviet Union in the 1950s. That alliance broke down by 1960, so then it launched into an alliance with Mao's China during the 60s and the 70s. And then even that alliance broke down by the 1970s, and communist Albania sort of retreated increasingly. It rejected the West, it rejected what it deemed to be decadent culture under capitalism, but it also rejected the East. And by the East, I mean revisionist, sort of reformist, de-Stalinizing ethos in the Soviet Union. And ultimately, even the Chinese were deemed to have basically betrayed true Marxism, Leninism. So the context may be a little bit new to you, but I think because we're dealing with languages and books and words that travel across borders, there might also be a way to think about how the story has to be international. I will insist today in trying to put Eastern Europeans or Southeastern Europeans or Albanians, but I don't want to limit it to any particular national group at the center. We are Balkanists, so perhaps we take some of this for granted, that the stories that we tell will have the Balkans at the center. As we all know, the world more broadly does not take that for granted, does not begin from that assumption. And so we'll try to explain a little bit about why that matters. We evidently see that today, why it remains crucial to put Ukrainians at the center of the stories that we tell. And so I'll try to kind of make the point today about what it might mean to put Albanians at the centers of these stories as well. All right, so let me begin with a book that I wrote. It's already been a few years since I wrote From Stalin to Mao, and one of the objectives that I had when I was writing this book, essentially, was to tell the story of how Soviet Union, this Soviet civilization, if you will, could be told both as a geopolitical story in the way in which Albania saw in the Soviet template something to adopt after World War II. It could be an economic story. You could tell that story in terms of development, how a certain Soviet template was also an idea of a certain socialist development, a kind of anti-capitalist alternative. But I also wanted to make the point when writing that book that the Sovietism was also about culture. It was about a certain horizon. And so I had a chapter in there when I was trying to figure out how was it actually that Albanians learned Russian? How was the language itself? And of course, when we talk about language, we're talking about more than just Russian. We're talking about a certain pattern of behavior, sociability, and acts. But I wanted to just understand that story, and I worked with state archives, diplomatic archives. I worked through the press and various printed materials to try to understand how that worked out. I could tell that story bureaucratically. I could tell that as a story of setting up courses and having people engage with Russian. And I knew that at some point there had been an actual language method translated into Albanian in 1951. That book looks like this. When I was a graduate student and a postdoc, I knew that there was a copy of this book in an Ohio library. And so I ordered it. It got delivered to me. I took a look at it. I briefly mentioned it in my book in the section on how Russian expanded to Albania, in a country where there is no there was no precedent for learning Russian en masse. And where we're not dealing with a language that is that is a Slavic language. So I knew that this book existed. I worked with it, but that was it. This was written by Nina Potapova, which is a manual that was translated in many languages in the 1950s. So you have German, French, English, Chinese versions of this. You have an English version of the Russian language methods as well. And so fast forward to about 3 months ago. Now, what you need to know about a place like Tirana, the capital of Albania, is that there are not many used bookstores. So instead, the practice is to sell used books on the streets, quite literally. So as you walk down a street on your way to the grocery store, what you will see on the sidewalks is essentially all the books and all the masses of communist era publications that have been sort of discarded, thrown away. They're not useful anymore to the people who had them. And so there's a kind of informal secondhand market for these things. And they're sort of on your way. And so about a few months ago, as I was walking along one of these sidewalks in Tirana, what did I notice? What did I find? Potapova's 1951 language methods that Albanians had used essentially to learn Russian in the 1950s. And so there was this very lovely man who was selling this book to me, and I told him I was going to buy it, I needed it, and the first thing he said, he warned me that if I was trying to learn Russian using this method from 1959, I had to be mindful that the book had a lot of missing pages. And so he kindly inserted a note inside of the book with all of the missing pages. And so he was very worried that basically my access to Russian through this older method was going to be choppy, that it was going to be incomplete. Of course, I told him, I'm not trying to use this to learn Russian. This is not, I'm actually interested in this as an artifact. I'm interested in this as an object. He was a lovely man. He had lots of jokes. He actually knew about Potapova, who she was. And he also had a lot of anecdotes about how Russian was introduced in Albania after World War II. The kinds of things that you will not find in archives, the kinds of things that are not recorded, the kinds of things that were not deemed worthy necessarily of being recorded by officials. But he was puzzled about what I wanted to do with this book, why I was intrigued in this as an artifact. And I think part of the answer there, if we sort of live through this method from the early 1950s, in particular in this Albanian version from 1951, is that we get a sense of beyond the mechanics and the grammar of Russian. So the structure of Russian, how it is introduced to Albanians, to this wholly new world to them. We see that the people that use the books in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s have left their marks on it. They have oftentimes written their names. They have oftentimes signed to kind of mark this to sort of mark it as theirs. Sometimes they have placed dates. So we have an idea about dates when they encountered Russian language for the first time. And sometimes there's even more than that. There are places. So they have given us these users, whether they're named or unnamed, have kind of given us a map of where and when they encountered Russian. And what you will notice if you sort of live through this book that has been discarded quite literally on the streets of Tirana, is that the encounter with Russian did not necessarily conform to the political story of Albania needing the Soviet Union to industrialize, to borrow certain technologies, to kind of advance a certain vision of socialism, that it was much more expensive than that. That this book, in a sense, offers a chronology, but also a geography of this encounter with Russian. That in fact, it persisted well past the break between these two states in 1960, that Russian was being learned well into the 60s after the two countries had split. The Albanian communist state signified that Russian was a language of socialist civilization, the lingua franca of central planning, the tool for fostering a certain kind of industrialization. In the book, I go at greater length in a particular chapter into how people from below could respond to these imperatives for their own sort of self-fashioning imperatives. They could sort of employ Russian for their own objectives. And so when we tell stories about encounters with Russian in the 50s, but also in the 60s and far more broadly than just that one decade, we're dealing with generational stories. An earlier generation encountered Russian in a certain context and setting, and a later generation encountered it when the two countries is essentially divorced. But that generation produced translators of Russian literature. It produced translators of famous novels, and it produced, when Albania had broken off with the Soviet Union in the early 1960s, it reminded us that language was still a necessity in the sense that the Albanian state had invested way too much to simply discard the needs. And so what do I mean by this? Let me illustrate this with a archival document from 1966. This is about 6 years after Albania has broken with the Soviet Union. And so the Soviets were now seen as having betrayed true Marxism, Leninism, but that didn't mean that Russian was no longer necessary and operative. And so this one document signed by Enver Hoxha, who is the Secretary General at the helm of the Communist Party, establishes percentages for how many school children will be expected to learn each language. And there are 3 languages that school children are going to learn as their first language. So the document specifies that Russian has to be taught to 60% of them. And then there's a designation there that English will be taught to between 20 and 30% of school children. And French will be taught to around 10 to 20% of school children. The optional second foreign language is withdrawn. So there is a gesture here, there's a recognition that languages, while Russian in the 50s was promoted as the key, as a kind of an opening, a path towards what was deemed to be socialist civilization, there is an ongoing recognition by the 60s. Albania is on the eve of a kind of a revolutionary upheaval in 1966, that languages are also instruments of subversion, potentially. That just as they can connect this country to certain distant realities, and that there's an economic calculation underlying that work, that there have been very clear events, whether it was 1956 in Budapest, when there was what the Soviets deemed a counter-revolution, and there were Albanians who studied abroad during those events who came home, and they were now deemed as potentially suspect. But there's an increasing recognition by the 60s that language is a terrain where you also have to be careful. You have to navigate the sphere in terms of its potential for negotiating different ideas about what socialism is and what it ought to be, and the shape of socialism that it's supposed to take. I mentioned that there's a kind of a revolutionary, Albania is on the eve of a certain revolutionary ethos in 1966. This is a time when Albania had embraced Mao's, not yet Mao's revolution, which was launched that year, that precise year in 1966. In fact, this document stems from just a few months after that had happened in China. But the following year, Albania would launch its own revolutionary upheaval, which would target religious communities. It would sort of, some of you may be familiar, but and some of you might be less so. But it was a wide-scale campaign designed to against churches and mosques, and particularly targeting that aspect of revolutionary of religious life that had developed over decades its own communal bonds and its own communal ties. And so that revolutionary upheaval in 1967, just months after this document was produced, was yet another reminder that the borders of foreignness had to be policed, and that the very fact that Enver Hoxha himself, on the one hand, keeps Russian in 1966, and allows a certain limited possibility for English and French, gets us to think a little bit about the kind of contradictory impulses at play here. The state appears to us as disciplinarian when it comes to languages and foreign models. But on the other hand, it also has urges to be seen as participating in a world, to be seen as revolutionary, progressive, as allied to certain international forces operating abroad. Perhaps French and English could be thought of in these moments of revolutionary upheaval as certain keys into a capitalist worldview, just as Russian may have been thought both as necessary, essential for the communist project, and potentially an open communication channel left open to a de-Stalinized world. By the mid-1970s, after there had been a sort of a brief period of relaxation, culturally speaking, there's yet another purge in Albania against in the cultural sphere. And the way that purge and that attack is framed by the 1970s is as one trying to distinguish and eliminate liberalism, forms of Western liberalism deemed to have corrupted, in particular Albanian youths, but also certain sectors of cultural life. Censorship was tightened. A wide range of books, foreign literature was taken out of circulation. They had teams set up to go through in libraries of the universities, in the cities, the National Library. For months and months and months, there was real work that went into identifying titles to be taken out of circulation, to be put in what they call reserve collections, so that one would need special permission to access certain books. And so language is not unrelated. Access to foreign languages and access to books in foreign languages is not an unrelated story to this sort of ongoing push and pull that officialdom throughout the late 60s, but then especially in the mid-1970s, are also deploying. When you look through the archives in this period from the 1960s, 1970s, you appreciate just how much work censors put into trying to kind of delineate those limits, delineate those borders. And at these points, of course, the dictatorship is also signaling that it would not tolerate cultural subversion. But in fact, the state itself is assuming that subversion is happening at all times. That is its departure point. Subversion is constant. Subversion is happening through foreignness, through certain nodes and through certain contexts with the West. And precisely because it is departing from that assumption that subversion is omnipresent, it needs to basically signal through these waves of censorship. It needs to basically bring that into being and to make it real and evident. Albanians continue to aspire to learn foreign languages. And in fact, it was precisely because of state-enforced civilizational points that had been driven home in the 50s and the early 60s that languages were understood as keys into the outside world. They sought to find creative ways to do it despite the increasing controls and the quite tightening censorship in years like 1974, 1975. So this had the unintended effect of giving a particular aura to foreign literature, to music, to access through radio. And then at a later point, of course, the story that some of you may be familiar with, television stations through the airwaves, in accessing a world that was not immediately physically accessible to Albanians who could not leave Albania. They couldn't have direct access to it, but that there were these alternative parallel ways of accessing the outer world. Again, very uneven. A lot of them could be switched off and then could be switched on depending on how one played that game with the censors and with the state. And there is here, I have to acknowledge, a large body of literature by Albanian authors in Albanian. And so we have to talk about language, even at this meta level, in terms of the scholarship that has been produced over the last 30 years. A lot of really great work on precisely these dynamics. Ardian Vebiu is just an obvious example of someone who has just written incredibly in a sophisticated way about the dynamics of otherness that the regime unintentionally put into effect as it was censoring certain modes of communication and as it was tightening access to foreign literature, foreign music, or foreign television, and so on and so forth. But there's a very, very rich Albanian language literature from those who were punished precisely for being and were framed as essentially being subversive in the way that they approached their own cultural output. So I want to acknowledge that literature, unfortunately, a lot of it is not translated into English. So we also get a sense, if we're purely entering this period of history from English, from sources that are in English, we're not really getting the richness of what Albanian authors and critics, historians, linguists have produced for us. So just as I say, as I speak today about language being a key and being an opening, language, this is an ongoing challenge. And so when the political imperatives are not there to invest in certain languages or to invest in translation or to invest in making certain knowledge accessible outside of a national framework, we lose a great deal. One book that would have been very familiar to a generation that was interested in learning foreign languages in the late 1970s was this. So this is one of these famous, I guess to a generation may have been famous, a classic French language learning method from the early 1950s, from 1953. This edition is from a revised edition from the 1960s. And it's a kind of book that circulated. This particular one is, my dad purchased it. My father purchased it in 1979. It's from our library. My dad has a habit of dating every book that he bought, and sometimes even putting in the location. So he may have not known that his son was going to be a historian, and so that's very helpful for me to know about exactly when these objects entered into our library. But this would have been familiar to a lot of people around the world in the 50s and the 60s learning French. It circulated hand by hand. It was a kind of an introduction to the French language, but it was a little bit more than that. Whereas the Russian method was introduction to the language of socialism and the language of the anti-capitalist civilization that Albanians were said that they were building in the 50s and the 60s. This was also a kind of introduction to French civilization. Now, a very specific idea of what French civilization is. And so there will be many ways that we could work with a book like this. If we kind of leaf through it, we would see that, first of all, it's a story about the Alliance Française, which is the institution that was very much at the center of Francophone cultural engagement after World War II, at the promotion of French language abroad. And so you could tell that story institutionally. We might talk about a certain French anxiety after World War II about English globalizing, increasingly becoming a language of communication via just the vast expansion of American raw power during stages of the Cold War. There's a preface in this book that would be very interested if someone were to do a kind of textual reading of how French is being mapped in the introduction to this book in light of this Cold War antagonism in the West as well. And then, of course, we could talk about how France is conceived in this part of civilizational project here as European, Eurocentric, monolithic, white, unabashedly European in its framework. So it's a very it's a particular vision of France and French civilization that, though revised in the 1960s, is in circulation in a place like communist Albania in the late 70s. And so let me add another perspective to any of these perspectives of how someone could approach a source like this. Albanian readers in the late 1970s would have followed along a family that is at the center of how this book is framed. They are discovering France, they are discovering French lifestyle, and they're discovering Paris and the various wonders of French civilization. And so an Albanian reader in the late 1970s would have been invited to kind of go along mentally on this journey, on this very specific journey of a sort of early 1950s version of what France was. And what kind of a journey would it be? Well, it would be a kind of mental mapping of a particular moment. In this instance, they would have noticed that this family would live in a fantastically luxurious apartment right in the center of Paris. You see the layout of that apartment right there with multiple rooms, with these incredible views. They would have read a lot about travel that they could not do. They would have read about fast trains and taxis and trips and a certain bourgeois lifestyle that was the epitome of the economic miracle of the 1950s. They would have also been invited to kind of map the French capital. They would have been invited to think about life in the quote unquote West as epitomizing the consumerism, a certain vision of the economic miracle that we often teach when we do talk about West Germany and France and a certain West post World War II moment. But certainly we would not talk about those things that we're talking about the West European 1970s. That would be distinctly not the story that we would tell in the post 73, 74 Western Europe. And so this is what I mean when I say, depending on who we center here, when we kind of craft these chronologies, the chronology will have to be different. This is a sort of a vision of Frenchness that circulates much later in Albania. And if a book like this would have been dated, certainly one could make the case that would have been very dated by the 1970s, it acquired a certain value in a place like communist Albania by the 70s, just through the sheer range of how much had been censored and how limited opportunities were for establishing these contacts with the West. And so these regimes or values are context specific. And so when we kind of center Albanian users, readers, the interlocutors with French in the stories that we tell, we sort of see how, in a sense, you could also say both Russian and French, the expansion of these languages intersected with political histories, but it didn't neatly align with them. And then in some ways, the Russian language had lived on despite what people in the Kremlin may have wanted it to do. And in a certain way, French and certain ideas of Frenchness circulated in places that Parisians did not care about or even intended to communicate with. In a sense, Russian and French could be vehicles for Europeans to talk past each other in addition to communicate. Looking at the story from the perspective of states and cultural planners makes a lot of sense, but when we shift the perspective to users, we realize that contact, mental mapping, meaning making also happen in unpredictable ways. There was a third mention in that archival document from 1966 that I showed. Russian was on it, French was on it, and of course the other language was English. So I want to just offer a few fragmentary ideas about, well, where does English fit into this story of the different timelines? Most famously, at a certain point in communist Albania, English would have been identified by these guys, these little volumes, which, as you can see here, got so much use that somebody had to use tape to hold one of them together. These were the famous essential guides to the English language for foreign students. Eckersley was this interesting character. He served in the Royal Artillery during World War I. He became a teacher. He specialized in teaching English to foreign students in the 1930s. The publishers Longman started publishing his books. They were revised over a number of years in the 1950s. And these particular editions that I'm showing here are from the early 1960s. And so for a certain, if we're going to kind of think of the story that I've been telling you as a generational story, so that there was an earlier generation that was primarily had access to Russian, and then there's a later generation which doesn't necessarily have Russian at the center of its mental mapping in the 70s. If English was going to be the vehicle through which you wanted to map the world outside Albania, this would have been familiar to a late communist era generation of Albanians. They were in a high demand and they were in short supply. So people borrowed them from each other. There was a kind of informal economy of these language books under late communism Albania. They borrowed, they lent them, they used them. And the effects of this kind of traffic are very difficult to find through official sources. This is sort of an informal history that you can access through oral history. You can access it through interviews, through memoirs. And so, in a sense, in a parallel to how the French 50s volume would have been extremely dated by the 70s, you can imagine how 1950s English would have probably been very dated by the 70s and 80s. As a language method. But when we think about the value that these kinds of books acquired under the specific context of a dictatorship that wanted to limit as much as possible but the potential for cultural subversion, we want to keep in mind that there was a kind of a use, there was kind of an added value to having access to these books that went beyond just their linguistic approach to the language. And so we may assume, and by the way, when I was growing up, I was hearing about essentials all the time, right? So people of my generation who were growing up in the 1980s may have already heard, those of you who are attending today may be very familiar with this. For a certain generation of Albanians, essential became kind of a synonym for English. And so people would say, mothers would brag, for instance, that their children were on essential too. And what they meant is that they had already started learning English, and they were already making headway through this course, through this set of volumes that was thought of as being sort of a structured way to acquire English. And of course, acquiring English was understood within certain socioeconomic context, and also within a certain milieu in communist Albania as incredibly valuable by the 1980s and earlier as well. We do not want to assume that with the collapse of communism in Albania in 1990 and 1991, these things fell completely out of circulation. In fact, essentials were still used after 1990, 1991. People kept using methods that were much, much older, just because there was not a lot else available. So it took a while for language access to expand and diversify, and that's a story that we need a lot more work on. But certainly languages, if we're going to think about these generationally, were still understood as being access points. I was not of the generation that ended up using these in the middle of the 1990s, but I did use some workbooks. And so what I'd like to show you very briefly, this is just to point out how much of a use these particular methods from the 50s got. This is literally kind of I can imagine some people were probably using them not as a whole book, but in chunks of pages that had been used so extensively. I wanted to show you some of my own workbooks from the middle of the 1990s when I was learning English. The reason I wanted to bring up this particular example was to kind of go back to this idea that I established earlier, that there's a kind of an alternative timeline to how words and methods and languages travel across borders. I had not remembered this workbook at all. And when I pulled it out, out of a cardboard box last summer, I was sort of struck immediately that in the mid 1990s, essentially, we were using this British method from the early 80s. So this is a workbook produced under Thatcher's government, right? So it's a Thatcherite British vision. I was surprised by both the examples that were provided in this workbook, but then I was not so surprised, because I thought about what we were trying. Whereas the earlier generation had been asked to use Russian as a lens to kind of fashion themselves as participants in socialism and a socialist project, and then some later generations had tried to use French and English to kind of fashion themselves as somehow opening themselves to a non-socialist world. In the 1990s, those of us who were sort of middle school, high school at that point, we were, in a sense, participating in a self-fashioning of ourselves as well. And the expectation now was the language of capitalism that had to be learned. And so it wasn't surprising that a Thatcherite vision of how one used English to become a capitalist subject was operative at this point. In this case, the prime minister, the fictitious prime minister there, is a woman in the story, and so we were also invited. In another example, I was invited, so that's my participation right there, to write a job letter. So English was being signaled in 1995, 1996 as the language through which one asserts one's qualifications in the marketplace. And so when we think about language also as possibilities for self-fashioning, we can kind of think through some of these hard divides between, the end of communism, the beginning of capitalism, 1990, 1991, Soviet periods versus post-Soviet periods. I must have been 15 or 16 when I wrote this, so I have no idea why I'm writing there that I was 20. Maybe in the self-fashioning that I was crafting through this letter, I wanted to really this imaginary job that was on offer in Britain. And this also reminds me of another point that I want to make, is that we're not necessarily reliable narrators of how transition unfolded. So we also have to kind of challenge our own memory of this period. And a good way to do it, I would think, is to sort of take seriously kind of these ground and a multitude of sources, sort of a richer source base for how the transition unfolded in the 1990s. So the 90s brought on a lot of new kinds of books. They brought on tapes, VHS. It was not the analog approach to languages anymore, and it was understood. But there's also a deeper history here. I'm just going to mention it. I'm not going to do justice to it. Not all families had access to foreign language training in the private throat. So in addition, there's an important socioeconomic story to distinguishing how access to foreign languages changes as we move on through these years in the 1990s, and precisely how there's an entire sector that develops to market languages as signifying certain things. So I'm knowledgeable. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I do want to leave some room for engagement. So let me just let me sort of make a kind of bring this a little bit further down to the present, where these are two languages that I have not talked about today. I mainly wanted to give you snapshots of Russian and French and English, kind of get you to think a little bit about some ways in which Albanians have essentially navigated these languages as opportunities, as possibilities for fashioning, as access points. Not an even story, not a story that often invites us to kind of use different chronologies, but this is an ongoing story as well. So these flyers circulated last year in Albania, and they are very specifically framing Italian as the language that will get you a call center job, which is this. Call centers are one of the big sectors in Albania under the kind of the current neoliberal model, and Italian is framed here as essentially your key to in an economy of scarcity, in an economy where so many young people do not see a future for themselves in Albania. Italian is again yet here marketed as an access point into a professional career, and to the right, German increasingly marketed as the key, the access point to becoming a nurse in Germany, or to become or to working for McDonald's, as you see right there on the right side, to becoming an Uber driver in Germany, to work for Amazon. So these are the kinds of when we think about languages and the different ways in which they've been deployed, but also in which the way people navigate them given their context. Though a lot of the story that I've told today is about the past, there is a way in which these kinds of dynamics are still operative currently in today's Albania. And I will leave it there. I welcome any and all questions or comments or clarifications, and I would be very, very glad to hear everything that you have to say.
Thank you, Elidor. What a fantastic job today.
Okay, I'm looking, this is weird. Looking for my own face and not seeing it. Okay, this is really exciting. I think in terms of the audience, if you guys can collect your thoughts and any questions you might have and raise your hand or put your questions in the chat. Let's see. I have plenty of questions too, but it looks like Teodora D'Agostino has a question. Do you want to get started, Teodora?
Thank you. Gladly. I was also listening with fascination and remembering some of my experiences trying to learn languages. And something I was reminded of is that, so in Bulgaria, one experience I had is that whenever I would look for a dictionary, because those were scarce, I would actually go to the second-hand bookstore or on the squares to look for a dictionary. And very often those dictionaries were actually from the interwar period, because there were just not enough printed under socialism, especially some of the languages. So I was personally trying to learn Italian and German. So I still have those dictionaries who are with the old script and with those, you know, the introduction in the dictionary speaks to an entirely different political context. And of course, here, these are the fascist dictionaries that you are using as a late socialist school child, right? Trying to learn languages that you want to use to self-fashion yourself. So, I mean, I think this is such a fruitful analysis, Elidor. I mean, I think it's absolutely completely fascinating. It's totally worth pursuing. And I'm sure that, you know, as you are going with this, you're going to think about other issues as well. But I mean, I think that the mental maps that people have been commenting on are not just to the 50s, but they probably take you also to these other years. And that might be also something worth looking at. Just random thoughts here, nothing really that insightful.
Could I briefly respond?
Yes, please do.
No, it's a very, very good point in the sense that of course the interwar there was quite a bit of circulation happening prior to you know, when we start stories with 45 or with which is something that I tried to do by architecture for when I wrote the book, we're reminded that there is kind of, you know, there is a no zero hour, and there have been so much back and forth and such a circulatory regime already in the 30s and the 20s, even prior to that. And so this is an important point when we with various Albanian colleagues, we oftentimes talk about how to conceptualize what's going on in the 70s as the censorship is tightening, as this certain cultural, you know, if you want to call it a culture, an assault on the cultural sphere. We're reminded oftentimes that they were working on multiple. I mean, the state itself and the way in which it sort of tried to police certain areas was worried about multiple things all at once. In addition to the West, the Albanian state specifically was worried also about the East, a certain kind of, but it was also about the distant past, right? The pre-socialist past. And so there were ways in which some of these, the past also asserted itself, and through books, through just objects that people had, libraries that had survived, signifiers, and of course architecture, which is my favorite because I've written about how Italian architecture was this constant reminder of a pre-socialist reality.
We have some more questions in the chat, but I'm going to ask my question first.
Okay.
And then we can turn to the chat. First, it's a comment and then a question. First, I think I love the way you tell this story. I had no idea that it could be so fascinating to look at and talk about foreign language textbooks, which we think of as sort of a dry, boring, kind of artifact. But it kind of reminds me of, like, I have my own nerdy collection of, foreign language textbooks and dictionaries, just like shelves of them that I've gathered over the years. A lot of them that I've bought from these secondhand book tables in Bulgaria and elsewhere. But I guess there's a couple things I really liked about your presentation. One is how you were able to take this story and bring it to life through the actual tactile objects and looking at the actual, drawing in the margins and the, kind of scribblings on them and the labelings, but also talking about the bookseller, who I was totally fascinated with and wanting to have a conversation with at that very moment, but how he becomes also a historical source that's really valuable. But so my question was, I was thinking about the Russian textbooks in particular, and on that one, I guess we didn't get a lot of visuals of maybe like images that were in it. But I remember the Russian textbooks that I was studying in the 80s in high school, and they were produced in the Soviet Union, but obviously for an English language audience and maybe even an American one, in which they showed kind of Soviet everyday life, very much in a, here's the apartment. I mean, nothing as luxurious as the French images, but, nevertheless, there was definitely a projection of kind of Soviet culture coming from, kind of whatever state-driven, sort of source. But so I'm wondering if you've ever looked at, compared, I guess, the Russian textbooks that would have been created for Albania or elsewhere in the bloc versus those that might have been produced for the capitalist world, and whether there was a difference there in the kind of mental maps they were trying to draw.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's actually that's been very much on my mind in case I decide to write this up, because actually the Potapova's English version is on eBay, and I'm tempted to I'm tempted to buy those 4 volumes just out of sheer curiosity. Just the tracing of these and trying to find them is its own kind of has its own kind of interesting story, and you end up engaging with people who have them for a variety of reasons. But that would be that would be very, I think that would be very interesting to see. I have not found a lot of engagement with Potapova and in this particular. I know that there's people now who are working on the expansion of Russian during the early Cold War in places in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. So perhaps there will be a little bit more work there. But a comparison of sort of just how it's deployed. I know that an American review of the language method sort of had a bit of a one-liner that, yes, there is quite a bit of communism here, so you need to overlook that part, but the rest of it is quite good. And so it would be very interesting to see, if there's a Chinese version and an Albanian version. The Albanian version does include Albanian collaborators. So this was a collaborative effort. It wasn't that they just took one version and just, so there's been some effort to contextualize it, and it would be interesting to kind of specify to what extent that was the case. Just wanted to very briefly on your first point, because it's very important to me. In many ways, the encounter with the person from whom I purchased this was in itself the story, as far as I'm concerned, because these are not. This is not someone who has won the lottery of post-communism in Albania. This is not someone who has the ability to have a store or to sell books. This guy is now selling books on Facebook, but he's there on the sidewalk every day, every Saturday, every Sunday, and in a way, talking to him, he was surprised that I was interested in it historically, because to him, right, this was a bygone era, and in a sense, it also reminded me about how much knowledge is out there. Other than I'm a big archive person. I've spent years in archives. I think they have so much to tell us about how the state operates. But there is this pool of experience and knowledge, and it's through kind of a sort of ethnography and interaction, and Chelsea is here, so I don't need to explain sort of the value of all of that. But it really, really struck me when I had that conversation about just by talking to him. And by the way, this kind of stuff is happening on social media these days as well, where people offer their anecdotes or their personal experiences. I almost wish that we could just gather a lot of this stuff and just kind of
digital
document.
humanities. Yeah, makes sense. Well, thank you, Elidor, for commenting on this and responding. And before we go to Chelsea, there was a question posted by Manuela Grama, who first of all is congratulating us as it's a fascinating project. And she asked you to comment on the aesthetics of the fonts used, especially for the book covers. Especially, she is thinking for the essential English that you have shown us. The material might have been originating in the 30s, but the font is very 70s. Could you respond to that, Elidor?
So this for the essential guide, right? For the essential guide, I will have to look that up and get back to you. I don't have I don't know. So it will be. I know that there are multiple versions. Most of the versions that I've been able to find are the revised editions from the 60s. Mm-hmm. So it will be interesting to. Oftentimes in different languages they. Well, this is for the Russian one that they use different covers, but the English mm-hmm. one is the different editions may have had different covers and different, but it's something that I would need to look it up.
Well, thank you, Elidor. I think it's probably a good detail that probably can open an additional avenue. Yeah. Thank you, Emanuela. And with this, I would like to ask Chelsea. She's been patiently waiting. Chelsea.
I wasn't waiting that long. Thank you so much, Elidor. I really enjoyed this. Excuse me. I really enjoyed this so much. And one thing I was thinking about was my own experiences learning Albanian, and particularly thinking about. So I took a class, Albanian for Foreigners, at the faculty in Tirana, and that was my first language class. And we didn't have a textbook, but our two instructors, the first who didn't speak English at all, were just like, they were language teachers. And so they had a lot of training in just language and literature. But then when I went back for my second Albanian more advanced language course, it was at the Lincoln Center and in Tirana. And what I was really struck by, I was the only student. So in fact, my then even teacher, I use the word loosely, she's now one of my closest friends, but she's not that much older than me. We were just having coffees a lot. And then I just started hanging out with her family, and we were calling that language, a lot of in-depth language learning. But at the time, I couldn't help but notice and take a lot of notes about the Albanian students learning English, because it was a certain type of cultural currency around English. And then they were it's also almost like they were learning a very Western American way of life along with English. And I was really struck by that. And then with the ways that English is promoted, and like learn English, you can travel, there's mobility, but not necessarily as tied to work. But those flyers you showed, like, learn German, be a babysitter, or learn Italian, work in a call center. And so I was just really interested too in how languages are taught today. And then how that even shapes what it means to learn. And I saw someone in the chat mention younger Albanians learning English through YouTube, for example. And I've seen the same thing on TikTok as well. And so I guess I don't even know if this is a question or not, but these are some of the things I was really struck by during the presentation.
Thank you very much. That's actually very, very productive. And it ties into with Alona's comment about sort of how they're, in talking about this as a generational story. For instance, if we think about the resonance that Italian had in the 80s and the early 90s in Albania, it was for obvious geographic reasons, the proximity, access to Italian television. That was a very, very important window for a certain generation of Albanians. And so I did not study Italian formally. I just picked it up because I needed to understand what was happening on TV in 1989, 1990, 1991. I mean, I kind of sat down and wrote words and tried to make sentences, but my introduction into Italian, for instance, was not formal at all. It was completely do it yourself, because I wanted to understand those cartoons and all the interesting things that were on TV. There's a very different generational dynamic that has moved on from needing to sort of acquire that language in quite that targeted fashion than our generation had. And in some ways one would, and then of course one has to bring in here sort of public education, investment, lacking in the kinds of resources that are needed to really make it happen to those who do not have access to do it privately. I mentioned this briefly, that even in the 1990s, a lot of the families that woke up to the reality of needing English pooled money together. So a couple of families would pool money together. They would hire a tutor, and then the tutor would come in, once a week or every other week, and they would sort of rotate it, right? This was a very common practice, at least in Tirana, in the mid 90s. And then there was these other foundations, which you've also noted, that have provided certain vehicles, certificate programs, and so on and so forth. But your question, I think, also gets at a certain kind of when I talked about certain values or a certain almost like branding of certain languages. The increasingly I've seen German assume over the years a very, very highly professionalized, so presented as in a professionalized way, and that gets us, I think, to with English, it's the other thing I wanted to note before I forget, the diasporic reality. I mean, Albanians are, for all intents and purposes, a diasporic reality. Albanian is now alongside, is used alongside Italian and English and Greek and German. And so this is yet another layer that kind of, when we talk about sort of from the point of view of Tirana, right, there are multiple ways in which a kind of multilingual approach would have to be thought in a way that also brings in the diasporic element. And so sometimes there are these things, there's tension in between these different imperatives. There's tension in between the economic imperative and the diasporic one. But I do think it kind of opens up for us a little bit. There is a tendency, and again, we're among Balkanists here, so I don't need to make the point, but there is a tendency, and we've seen it even in the last 2 weeks, to insist on languages as markers of certain belonging. And I think, it's, again, to work against that as much as possible, particularly when it comes to cultural work.
Thank you so much for that, Elidor. Keith Wagner, do you want to just go ahead and say your question?
Yeah, I think I can summarize because thank you so much for this presentation. It has me thinking about so many things as a learner and instructor of French. So like working with those materials now, what do they capture with culture? Anyways, I won't ramble, but going on what you were just saying about branding of languages, it seems like French didn't really open itself up to, at least with those materials, this opportunity to bring Albanians in and create, part of the workforce in the same way you said, Margaret Thatcher and the capitalism. So was the goal of these French books really language acquisition, the Moget that you mentioned? I just wanted you to comment on that unique sort of thing. Was French not really trying to bring people in?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that question. And it's in a sense, it was my sort of instinct when working with it would have been to read it as both, as trying to do both, as in a sense trying to give an overview. And again, I have to trust linguists and those who are working with language in a professional setting in ways that I am not, when they tell me that these things are so dated, right, in their approach to how language learning has been done over decades now. But there was, and to that extent, we could also think about it from the perspective of the people that encountered that text and work with it in an autodidactic way, as having had that function ultimately, like having provided an avenue for a certain kind of French to be acquired. It's the civilizational aspect of it that I found sort of provocative and interesting, because in a certain way there have been critiques of the Moget precisely on that point, quite rightly, about this monolithic version of French that sort of comes along with the language learning, and so, but of course, in a completely different context, that was exactly what was interesting. If we for a certain audience in a highly restricted cultural and political sphere, and so the language was of course important, but there was this other layer, this other dimension. Given how limited opportunities for actual physical travel were to kind of get along. I written this article a couple of years ago, and I just sort of, I feel like I've been, I'm reminded of it. I looked at films, at how sort of certain audiences in Albania, but also in China in the 1960s and the 70s were responding to the films that were available. And the Chinese were watching all these Albanian films, and the Albanians were watching all these Chinese films, and they were so confused, about what was on the screen. But there was one element that was kind of a common denominator, is that they were very interested in Western. Whenever there was some sort of an element that was deemed to be Western-like, right? That sort of signaled a certain kind of extra interest among the audiences. And Albanian documents are full of this kind of stuff, where they're noting how, there's a demand for this, there's a demand of this, and we need to address it somehow, right? So even within the bureaucracy, there are people that push, but of course, you have to convince the upper layer, even in a kind of a very hierarchical system like that.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate it. And it was a really good comment about, I think, the elites, that need to be pushed, and to be convinced, and when shifts occur. Our next question, Elidor, comes from Arbor. And Arbor, would you like to ask your own question, or you prefer for me to read it for Elidor?
No, I can ask it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Welcome.
Elidor, first of all, thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it and liked it due to it was, I can say, a rich presentation that gave me a perspective on how language is related structurally to the different regimes that exist, especially of the communist regime. And I remember when I was visiting Bunkart, that in a kind of way is a museum, if we can say, regarding to the period of communist Albania. And I remember seeing there how the state, or let's say the people who worked for the state, used the steam technique to open letters and read them before people could get this letter. And I remember that this event, it was like 5 years ago, I suppose, gave me a feeling of an anxiety. I don't know how to explain, but how people's privacy was breached in a kind of way that is assembles to the Big Brother of George Orwell. And that's why I ask you, in a kind of way, when we learn history in school as a subject, we take a brief explanation of the major events that, let's say, shaped social structures, shaped institutions and everything, but we don't get a perspective on the social individual, on individuals, people, let's say, individual's life that is important under different regimes. That's what my question is. Do you think that explaining or trying to give this kind of presentations that are really near to the individual's lives could give people in Albania and everywhere, to be honest, a better, let's say, perception of history itself and the different regimes that exist? And thank you.
Thank you, Arbor. Thank you. Elidor?
Thank you very much, Arbor. That's I'm in full agreement with you. There's a lot of need to kind of, there's been a tendency, and I've written in Albanian over the years about how there's a tendency for communism to be, because it was such a personalistic regime, then there's been this intense fixation with writing it as the history of this one individual, or this this hierarchy, right? And in a sense they were important, and of course, it was a dictatorship, that we understand the role of the party in a one-party state. But there is a lot of need to integrate everydayness and daily, and sort of to kind of bring the richness of a kind of individual life in this at the end, and even in some of these exhibits that they've set up, I think it's been most effective when it's been less sort of that conventional framing, but more on sort of bringing in kind of a multitude of voices to the story. And particularly, I think actually I would go even a little bit further, and I would say it's becoming ever more urgent, because we have a generation now that there is no reference point. You might as well be talking about, when you talk about the 1980s, you might as well be talking about an alien, so there is, we've been trying, it's the kind of work that takes time. The right incentives also need to be there to do this kind of work. So there's a lot of factors about how that might explain, but we definitely need a lot more, because I also think and we had an event last summer, for instance, with, I mentioned Ardian Vebiu, who is someone who has a very a brilliant blog in Albanian, Pejzajet të Fjalës.
I know.
And through a number, we did an event where we tried to do this just through the stuff that we have, you know, the objects, the books, the kind of the material culture that is left, and sort of to try and bring in, you know, a bottom-up perspective on histories that we think we know. We think we know what was important and what the timeline was and where the agency was. But if we kind of do this bottom-up approach to it, the benefit is it invites people in, because you know, and this was one of my objectives just today, was just I want this to be open-ended, right? I mean, what people's encounters with languages and foreignness has been ought to be part of this. And so there must be the famous Alltagsgeschichte. We need a lot more of that in Albania.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I have actually one last question. I think we want to wrap up soon, but I liked at the beginning how you talked about how you were going to put Albania at the kind of center of the world. I think that's really important. I've had students come up to me before and say, when I read your book, it seems like Bulgaria was at the center of the world. And I went, well, it is for the people that live there. But also there's a way in which by doing that, we kind of decenter or maybe recenter world history in important ways. So I just wanted to thank you for that. But I was just wondering, because I guess I first went to Albania in 1993, and one of the things that really astounded me, I mean, you can think about that time period and what was going on, but was actually how many people spoke fluent English with an American accent and other languages, you know, definitely Italian and other languages. Far more people than I encountered in Bulgaria or, you know, anywhere else in the region. And I was going, wow, like, what is the deal? So I feel like there's something special when it comes to Albanians, Albania, and this kind of really multilingual space, because, you know, and we think of Albania sort of isolated, at least historically. And I mean, at that moment when I arrived, people are like, who are you? Why are you here? You know, I was like tourism, you know, and people were really kind of astounded that I showed up. But already at that moment, Albania seemed way more globally connected to me, at least through language, than some of the other parts of the Balkans I was traveling through. So is there something special and center of the world about Albania in all this that would tell a different story than maybe other Balkan countries or other countries?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think one way that I think about it is that, in a sense, precisely kind of why I'm countering this traditional, conventional view of repression as, you know, and of course we have very rich a body of work in Albanian on exactly how repression operated. But it did have unintended effects. It did create these kinds of sort of opportunities for projection. Again, not available necessarily to everyone. So we also want to specify, we want to kind of, you know, tell that story as much as possible from the ground up. But I did think that there was, given geography, given the geopolitics, given the sort of serious engagement that Albania had over 50 years with a number of foreigners and their ideas, ideologies, and their worldviews, right? That the exchange for me has been a very productive lens through which to try and kind of internationalize this kind of history. And also the other specificity of Albania here that I would insist on within a kind of a Balkan, but even more broadly, Eastern European dimension, is just the mass exodus in the early 90s. So those languages, those keys to the outside world that had been thought of as being so essential, then were opportunities for the people that left Albania and 1990, 1991, 1992, to situate themselves abroad in certain ways. And that story is also a painful story in many ways. There is an incredible body, for instance, of Italian novelists that have emerged out of the Albanian speaking diaspora in Italy. And they've kind of recounted that story of how they had to navigate their ideas of Italy and Italianness to the reality that they encountered once they went to Italy. So I think it's a productive way to kind of open up to your accent remark. I just wanted to add just a little bit of detail here. And in many ways, I'm trying also to honor those teachers. The fact that I got an American accent was due to my teacher. Her name was Spresa, and I worked with her in the mid-1990s, and she had an American accent. She had acquired it by going to the United States I think I remember correctly. And so that's the accent that I got by default, is the one that I was mimicking in certain ways her way of speaking English. And but it signals that there's sort of whether you can do it via Italian, whether you can do it through English, whether you can do it through a number of other languages, that this is also sort of a story of a kind of personal bonds that are established at a kind of a very difficult moment for Albania in the a very chaotic transition in the history of the country.
Okay, I guess Chelsea also was pointing out there was a question by Elena Shuvalova, who is asking about to what extent do you consider a person under socialism or post-communism free, or to what extent could you consider them to be free? And then she says not knowing a foreign language. So I'm not really sure if that gets at her, or if that's a clear question for you, but.
Yeah, I mean, so we do wanna one thing that I'm trying to kind of work against when I talk about this transition as sort of open-ended in a certain way is against this tendency which we're seeing now in talking about the 90s and transition as essentially imported ideas. So there were these concepts that were just applied to Albania: shock therapy, the World Bank came in. There were these kind of foreign imported notions, and then Albanians just sort of, which to me it's striking because it's sort of a parallel to how Sovietization was framed in an earlier generation, that it was this kind of externally imposed, coercive, which for many Eastern Europeans it was, but it also was more than that. And in the case of Albania, there were dynamics of self-Sovietization that I try to capture in my earlier work. So when we talk about notions of freedom and opportunity, it's a lot more, I think. So I insist on the agency of Albanians themselves as a way to say, you know, when we talk about the 90s in Albania as basically just being the story of how the 90s were in Poland or in Russia, or we're getting, I mean, I think we're getting the history wrong to begin with, but we're also really not making room for how people navigated notions of freedom according to the kinds of tools that they had at their disposal. And there were individuals who had sort of that access available to them, just as there were individuals who had to basically put in a lot of work, and this was actual labor, to learn and to develop the mechanisms through which they could kind of. And so I think self-fashioning is an interesting way to think about a lot of these processes that are happening, and to kind of resist uncritically importing Western ideas about what transition was about and kind of just plopping them onto places like Albania.
Thank you so much for answering all of our questions. I have to say, as the chair of also a Slavic language department, I'm going to go look at all of our Russian textbooks. We have big stacks of ancient Russian textbooks in the department, and I'm going to go dig through those like as soon as possible because I'm fascinated now. So thank you very much for all of you, for your talk, which was wonderful, and for answering all of our questions. And I guess our time is up. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.